Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Arrogant. So with Module 22 we got the new trial, the Crown of Keldron, and this trial can be pretty challenging, especially on terms of maximizing your output in damage. So throughout this trial I've recorded pretty much every single run that I have done in terms of the damage the characters have done, and also looked at the effectiveness of, let's say, healers and tanks in comparison with each other. So in this video I'd like to go over my tier list of all the classes ranked for Module 22, focusing primarily on the endgame content that is currently the most challenging as it is right now. So first up, we'll go through all of the DPS classes, later on we'll go through the tanks, and lastly the healers. And at the very end I'll go through some of the hardcore data that I am rating these opinions off. So with that said, we go to create our character and we have to choose one of the following 9. First up, we take the Barbarian. Now its DPS paragon, the Blade Master, has a pretty decent setup with its unique mechanic being its battle rage. You'll enter combat, you'll use your encounter powers, which will then go on cooldown, as you can see down in the bottom there, and after you cast those encounters you fill up this rage meter, which allows you, when you go in combat, to enter this fury state, allowing you to attack with your at-wills a whole lot faster. But as it stands right now, I rate the Barbarian DPS on average. Here is a quick look at the damage log that you will see on an endgame character as it stands. Just over 770,000 encounter DPS, this being the average damage per second that you want to look at when we go and compare the other classes. And so we go to the Bard DPS. Here you have the Songblade paragon path, which will have the unique playstyle of casting songs with your perform ability, and these songs have active up times which can cause buffs to your extra party members, along with having feats that will go along with that, and you can use a said feat performer to be casting your encounter powers very often. So with its playstyle, you'll generally go and enter combat by casting a song, and from there you'll be casting your encounter powers, which a lot of them are very mobile based, as you see here. We're just killing off these groups of wolves. However, in general, the Bard DPS character can be very RNG. We'll just quickly go back to its features, and one of its powers is what really makes the Bard right now: Mystifying Strikes. Looking at a combat log, you can see Mystify deals just about 44% of the Bard's average damage within the endgame trial. Again, the Bard I'm gonna have to put in poor, as it's dependent on like one class feature, and for the rest it's pretty terrible. Next we go to the Cleric DPS. Here you have the Arbiter paragon. You have a pretty unique playstyle with regards to relying on a divinity pool on the left there to cast most of these big damaging powers. Unfortunately, the area effect on your powers are very limited, but that really makes up for it in single target fights. In a trial scenario, you can do really well, but the skill ceiling is pretty high on this class, so I wouldn't pick it as a new player to this game. What you will generally be working on is these stacks up at the top left there, and what you want to do is alternate between your powers to gain those certain stacks, and if you make a wrong cast, then you utterly destroy your perfect balance, which destroys your entire rotation and it destroys your overall damage effectiveness. However, from what I've seen within the new trial, the Cleric DPS I rate as pretty good there. Looking at a data sheet, you can see dealing over 820,000 encounter DPS, so it can be very competitive, but still not up there with the best. Next up we go to the Fighter. You will be going with the Dreadnought paragon path to output as much damage as possible. You'll be using like one at-will power, and then an encounter power, then an at-will, and then an encounter power to deal massive damage within AoE. Otherwise, you have some of the highest magnitude damaging powers in the game that there is right now. With that said though, you're pretty slow at attacking, which doesn't really help you with the current meta of running a Band of Air and basically having a lot of fast hits. So again, as the Fighter stands, Unfortunately, I'm going to have to put it in average as it doesn't quite fit the meta. It can perform very well, but still not as good as a Cleric DPS or even up there with the Godly tier. Here is an example of an act log, and the fighter was dealing nearly 790,000 in counter DPS. So next up we go to the Ranger. Now with this class you'll have the liberty of choosing both your paragons, either the Hunter paragon or the Warden paragon. Now depending on which paragon you choose, you can specify on what kind of damage you want to be dealing, whether that's AoE damage or single target damage. And right now the balance is a bit more towards the Hunter with regards to single target damage, just by the sheer amount of magnitude, and along with switching between stances and having your roots. And overall your playstyle will have you shooting your bow at enemies, or you can even go and switch stance to melee and go and attack people with your little axes or knives depending what you're using. Overall this class is pretty fun, especially with its stance switches, and I would recommend it, but it can be a bit confusing with regards to what stance should I be in and what counter power should I be casting. As you can see, every power has like 2 sets of abilities there depending on what stance you're in. With that said, however, the Ranger can perform pretty well within endgame content right now, up there in the good tier along with the Cleric. It has fallen slightly since my previous video. To look at a chart from a Ranger DPS, we can see it was dealing up to about 780,000 in counter DPS. So next up we go to the infamous Rogue. Right now this class is absolutely thriving in the current meta with the entire gear setup that's like best in slot. You will have 2 different paragons, the Whisper Knife or the Assassin. Now the Assassin is much more preferable and pretty much the only viable paragon path within single target. The Whisper Knife is what you use in AoE to really quickly and efficiently kill off these groups of enemies in just 1 or 2 hits. Of course, if you have a maxed out build. So right now, I absolutely have to put the Rogue in Godly tier. It can perform some massive amounts of damage in single target. You can see this is myself here, nearly dealing 1 million in counter DPS in that new trial. And as a class in general, it's pretty fast hitting with lots of damage over times, lots of numbers on the screen, and has the ability to go invisible to quickly get the advantage on your enemies. By going invisible, they also won't be able to target you either. You can see them are there being confused until they decide they're going to target my companion instead of me. Moving on, we have the Warlock. As a DPS, you'll be going with the Hellbringer paragon path. Here you'll have a bunch of powers. Many of them will be dealing like damage over time and having the benefit to output quite a heavy amount of damage if you have the time to do so. You'll also be summoning a soul puppet to help you out, and you also can make use of a feature which will allow you to take advantage of combat advantage stat, much like the Rogue, when you're fighting, let's say, AoE or solo. And you can summon like mini devils to fight for you temporarily. But with that said, the Warlock can perform excellent within the current meta in endgame content, and thus I have to put the Warlock in Godly. And I can back that up again with another act log here, with the Warlock dealing over 940,000 in counter DPS within the new trial. Massive amounts, and definitely deserves Godly tier along with the Rogue. And lastly, we have the Wizard. The Wizard again has 2 paragon paths, the Arcanist or the Thaumaturge. Now, most people, at least for AoE, will go with the Arcanist to take full advantage of their nightmare wizardry. For single target, well, I'm no expert, I suggest you find a build, but they can perform fairly well. Their playstyle is again a wizard, so you're going to want to be standing a little bit further away from the enemies so they don't attack you all too often. However, they have a bunch of powers which, to make the most of them, you generally want to be up close. Their special ability is, well, to simply have an extra power to cast, and those powers slotted in that extra slot will have a special ability. The wizard itself has suffered a little bit with regards to the meta shifting away from stacking lots of action point gain, as you could use Arcane Empowerment, enter this state and be able to cast encounter powers really quickly. They only have like a 3-second cooldown, meaning you can literally spam that and make the use of outputting massive amounts of damage, but it would require you to be able to cast your daily a lot more often, and the meta's kind of shifted away from that, so they struggle a bit more. So unfortunately, the wizard will just have to go on average like the fighter and the barbarian. From what I've seen, we can get up to about 700 and nearly 50,000 encounter DPS in the new trial. So that again is all of the DPS ranked up. Now of course this will change as the game progresses and we unlock different types of gear. The balance in the game generally shifts around what gear is available. Right now the meta is on this touch of wind and getting that to proc as many times as possible, and the wizard doesn't do a bad job at that at all. It just doesn't have great powers to back it up in terms of damage. So overall, again, just take this with a grain of salt, and let's move on to our tanks. First up, we have our barbarian. Now here you will have your sentinel paragon path, built to absorb maximum amount of damage along with making sure the enemies are attacking you rather than your allies. Now it has a pretty decent toolkit with regards to, let's say, buffing your allies' speed along with buffing your allies' damage in a boss fight, and also increasing your hit points to insanely high amounts. Unfortunately, the meta right now in endgame with the new trial is to avoid having as much hit points as possible and prioritizing your defensive stats. Along with that, the barbarian struggles to hold the attention of its enemies, mainly due to it having an ability which relies on taking massive amounts of damage before outputting much threat, and its overall playstyle is pretty handy. You'll again have this fury meter where you will enter unstoppable, and at this stage you will block all incoming damage based on your stamina bar to the right, and as long as it lasts you can just attack and not take any damage off your hit points. However, once that's out you can just block manually like this, but then you cannot attack. So unfortunately the Barbarian Tank for me has to go in bad. I have not seen any good Barbarian Tanks out there. Not that I play with everybody, I'm sure somebody somewhere has made it work, but it's not easy and the current meta doesn't give it any favors. So next up we go to the fighter. Now here you will have the Vanguard Paragon path, which again, like the Barbarian as a tank, you will just be there to absorb as much damage as possible, and on top of that attempt to make sure the enemies are attacking you and not your allies. And the fighter does this really well, with retaliating damage whenever it takes damage back, having a nice setup of powers to generate an absolute ton of aggression to make sure the enemies are targeting you and not your allies. It has a good old dig in power where it can essentially absorb massive amounts of damage on its shield ability. Unfortunately, you'll have to be actively doing this. You can again just manually block by holding like shift and also attack while doing so. Overall, the fighter is massively tanky. It's got some really good powers to absorb as much damage, and on top of that it has some great abilities to just keep on top of the threat list of enemies by just outputting its own sustained damage, along with just having a really good baseline for the amount of threat it can generate. You get hit, you attack them all back. In my opinion, it does lack a bit within AoE, but the meta right now is to use a Ring of Condemned and run around like a headless chicken, and the fighter is not going to have any problem at doing that as any other class, so not a big deal. So right now in terms of tanks, the fighter is up there in my opinion in the godly tier. A good tank player can generally keep the aggro all the time off the boss without too much worry, even in this current meta with some massive damage output from rogues and warlocks and some clerics and rangers. So next up we go to the Paladin. Here you have the Justigar paragon path, which again, like tanks, is built to maximize your survivability and increase the ability to make sure the enemies are focusing on you and not your allies. You essentially have, unlike the other two tanks, a divinity bar like you would see on healers. Essentially, when you're in combat, you can cast abilities, let's say Templar's Wrath, which costs me divinity. You can see a portion, and I can cast this power again, no cooldown at all, and I can cast it a third time. And then I have to wait a bit to get my divinity back before I can cast it again. And this is very good for burst aggro generation, but with the current meta, it has shifted to using an hard taunt, which is an ability which we can see will just place you on top of the threat list. Unfortunately, not for very long with regards to the massive amount of damage rogues, warlocks, clerics, rangers can output in the current meta, and so you'll end up having to use smite like 5, 6, 7 times in a row to maintain aggro. But timing is key, and once you get the timing down, you don't have too much problem, but it leads to a bit more of a stale playstyle, as you'll just be smiting all the time and otherwise using your at will, and of course blocking in between. Generally what you do is you hold down your left click and like spam your shield button, and that also allows you to essentially animation cancelling, giving you more of action points. Overall, the Paladin favors more so to protecting your allies with supporting healing them with this exact combo, Sheltering Light and the Shield of Faith daily power, and that can help out massively in a trial scenario when you have 9 others that all need support in being healed. The fighter tank does have its own abilities to reduce the damage that allies take, but you generally need to be grouped up for that. So in the current meta, the Paladin tank is very good, especially with supporting allies with extra healing. It can hold aggro, it can survive, not as good as the fighter in general. One thing I would emphasize on it being better than the fighter is the ability to heal allies or help heal them. And so I'll have to put the Paladin tank in just good. And so that's the 3 tanks ranked. Keep in mind again, this is from my experience. So we'll move on to the 4 healers. How will I rank those? First up, we have the Bard. Now here you will be taking the Minstrel Paragon. Now again, like the DPS path, you will have these songs, which you will cast when you're in your performance mode. Here you can go and cast specific keys. Once you get the combination right, you'll cast said song, and that will then be active, as we can see at our performance bar. And we can cast all sorts of different songs, giving our allies different heals, different buffs, so on, and you can read all of the tooltips there. The unique thing for the Bard is again playing these songs, but also having the ability to buff your allies a bit. You can see with Blaze Flamenco, you're going to increase your allies' damage output. On top of that, with regards to our storyteller, you can increase the damage that DPS deal. You can decrease the damage tanks take, and you can increase the healing that the healers heal for. And that makes you one of the best classes at just providing support to your allies in terms of increasing their effectiveness. However, right now we are very bugged in regards to our powers not really working the way they should, the way they say they should. For example, our Rejuvenating Carol says it has 200 heal magnitude, when in fact right now it only has 100 heal magnitude, and it's been nearly a year that the Bard has been out, and these kind of things have not been fixed. However, there are just a few easy fixes that can be implemented, which will make the Bard very competitive with regards to other healers. But right now, it's sorely lacking within the current meta. Right now, in the new trial, people are pretty new and really need a good healer, so they will look more towards a cleric than a bard. A bard will generally be your second-rate healer. Your healer you will pick up when the content's much easier and all you need is a bit of a heal every now and again. So unfortunately, the Bard Healer is gonna have to go in poor along with its DPS counterpart. It really needs a pass over in regards to fixing its bugs and issues, and maybe a increase here and there with regards to its effectiveness for it to become viable in the current meta. So next up we go to the Cleric. Now here you'll be on your devout paragon path, and again you'll have a setup which is going to be very similar to what we've seen on the Paladin with regards to a divinity bar, which you will then cast powers and they'll use that bar, and then you're going to have to balance out how many powers you use, and your powers that use this divinity are usually those that heal your allies and somewhat also protect your allies. Now the Cleric has some really good benefits. It has this power healing word, which creates an effect on you that just heals you over time for nearly 20 seconds. Then you have another ability where you can give yourself a massive heal. You can give one target a massive heal, or you can go and select multiple targets and share the heal amongst them with Bastion of Health. And that's generally how you'll play. You'll try and maintain healing word on everybody, use your Bastion to top anybody else who's kind of low, and then use your Divine Glow to increase your divinity regeneration. And overall, you're pretty much the best healer in the game right now, with also your daily powers being really effective, just protecting allies and healing everybody around you. You can have tab ability to also heal everybody around you, or just heal said tank a massive amounts. So right now in the current meta, the Cleric Healer is pretty much in godly tier and the best healer out there. And so next up we have the Paladin Healer, and here you will be taking the Oathkeeper Paragon. Now you're really good at just giving massive shields to your allies. You can see we can pretty much cover half of our hit points in an extra layer of shield, and this shield is then equivalent to that portion of my own hit points, so that's about 60% there. Unfortunately, we can't give this amount of shield to everybody anymore. You generally are going to have to choose between healing multiple targets with giving them a smaller shield, or just healing one or two targets and giving them a bigger shield. So within dungeons where you only have a few people to heal, you can generally do a pretty good job at that. But in a trial, you'll generally be resorting to something that will heal everybody a little bit. Overall, you don't have any like heal over time, things that are going to heal people passively. You generally focus on just giving people shields when they need them, with a bit of heal that goes with it. Overall, Paladin is the best at what it does in creating these shields, but in the current meta, it can perform very well, but not to the point and not to the extent that a Cleric can, with just outputting pure amount of heals all of the time. So unfortunately, the Paladin Healer is going to have to go in good. So lastly, we go to the Warlock. Now here you will be taking the Soul Weaver Paragon path. Again, you'll be focusing on using powers that consume Soul Weave, unlike Divinity, but exactly the same playstyle. You will have the Soul Weave meter, which again will empty as you cast your powers which consume that Soul Weave, and then you'll regenerate it slowly, allowing you to spam as much heals as need be, but then having a period of where you'll need to spend time regenerating that back. Again, you can completely play as a pacifist using like 2 at-wills here. You can use 1 at-will, which will actually give you a shield or your ally a shield. Again, it's nowhere near to the extent as a Paladin Healer. You also have the option to choose between healing over time with Fey Pact or healing with an extra shield without the heal over time. Generally, what you'll want to go with is the healing over time, and I believe, and from looking at the math, you can see that a Warlock Healer could actually be the best healer in the game with just raw outgoing healing, and unfortunately it lacks with regards to its heals are contained within an area. As with the Cleric, you can be within like 80 feet, and with a Warlock you have to be within this green area to benefit from these heals, or this other green area for this buff. And so right now the meta doesn't give the Warlock any favors, and so unfortunately I'm going to have to put the Warlock Healer in average. It could be much higher depending on what content you're running. It is a much trickier healer to play as it relies on your allies actually positioning themselves correctly. So there we have it, my entire tier list for all the classes within the game right now. Again, meta changes depending on what gear and what content we're running, and this is mainly based off the new trial. There are tons of other content in the game, and so your effectiveness will increase or decrease depend on exactly what content you're attempting to run with. Overall, take this all again with a grain of salt. It's not necessarily how you're going to experience the game as I did. I'm running endgame content all the time, and I don't exactly run with a massive variety of people. So to conclude this video, I'd like to go over how did I reach these conclusions with regards to ranking the DPS. Now, a big factor comes from the amount of damage these classes can output in terms of DPS within the first phase of the trial. Take it as like a dummy test. The dragon doesn't exactly move around a lot. You don't have many mechanics that you have to pay attention to. You do have 2 artifact calls usually, and thus you can output your massive burst. Overall, I feel it's a pretty fair test. Across the board, you can see the results here. I've just taken like the top 2 best that I have seen on that said class, and again I can go and inspect a bunch of these for you. You can pause them and have a look for yourselves at these results if you want to do so, and we can check the Warlock and Wizards ones here as well. And then I do have like the ones that didn't hit the top 2 results here as well, and I've also went and had a look at all of the ones within the phase 2 as well, but that relies a lot more on your skill with regards to playing the mechanics of the content than just knowing what to do on your class, and thus I don't feel this as a very fair contest with regards to these classes. This is basically your class and then the amount of DPS adjacent to it, like Rogue, massive amounts of damage. There's no way that this is not one of the best classes out there. If I can output this damage, then most other people can as well, and a Warlock's pretty close behind that, and so is a Cleric if you play it and time everything like perfectly. And so one last thing to, let's say, digitally compare each class in terms of DPS to one another, you can see these would have been my results. I know I did rank the Bard as lower, but from my data it did show me that one of the best results on a Bard was as high as it got here, just nearly 800,000 DPS. But again, that relies on a lot of RNG. You could get higher up this line, you could end up lower down the line, depending on how lucky you are with this one class feature, Mystifying Strikes. So I don't really know how to rank the Bard. I just feel that feature is a little bit busted right now, and it's kind of abusing it. Otherwise, without the feature, you're way down the bottom, and right now it appears to rank like so. You can get some really good barbarians, rangers. I'm sure there are wizards that can perform better than like over 750,000 encounter DPS, but I haven't really seen any that can do so, at least without a stalwart lion. And so hopefully I presented this well. If I did, consider leaving the video a like. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.